So I called dibs to introduce our next guest on NowFest 2020. I had taken his course on edX, and it was a great experience, which actually made me get involved in the field of behavioral science. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm here. So let me introduce with a lot of excitement Professor Dilip Soman. He is one of the topmost experts in behavioral science today and its applications to consumer well-being, marketing, and policy. He is a Canada Research Chair in Behavioral Science and Economics, Director of the Behavioral Economics and Action Research Center at Rotman, and the author of the best-selling book, The Last Mile. He will be covering the importance of context in behavioral science during this session. So I'm very excited to hear from you. I'm sure everyone all over the world is too. So over to you.
Thank you, Shrishti. That was a very, very kind introduction. Um, as Shrishti mentioned, I'm going to speak about context, and I'm going to make the simple claim that context is everything. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to share with you, firstly, a slideshow which will give you a visual accompaniment to what I'm speaking about. I'll make this simple claim about context being everything, but I'm going to do it by doing the following few things. I'm going to speak very briefly about the center that we run here at the University of Toronto called BEAR, and one of our initiatives called BI.org, Behaviorally Informed Organizations. I'm then going to spend a little bit of time on three scholars. We'll start with William James, who lived and worked in the late 1800s to the early 1900s, Egon Brunswick, who lived and worked in the early 1900s, and of course, Richard Thaler. And I'll get to the punchline in terms of what I mean by context is everything. We'll then talk about three simple examples, three case studies, which illustrate some of the points that I want to make, and then end up with some prescriptive advice. So that's the agenda for my session, and hopefully we'll have a lot of time for questions and discussions at the end. So let me start off very briefly by talking about the various activities that we do here at the University of Toronto. BEAR is a very Canadian animal. It stands for Behavioral Economics in Action at the Rotman School. And we are a research center. We're different from many other research centers in that we actively work with a lot of our partners, be they partners in government or partners in the for-profit industry or a lot of not-for-profits, and we co-create research with them. One of our initiatives is called BI.org, the Behaviorally Informed Organization. And the big question that we raise in that initiative is how do we actually get organizations to embed behavioral science in the way they operate? How do we get organizations to live and breathe and actually use behavioral science in every single aspect of their operations? And then finally, as Shrishti mentioned, we run a course called BE 101X. And I know there's a lot of people perhaps on this call and elsewhere that have gone through the course. And to all of you, thank you very much for being part of it and for being part of the BE 101X family. It's been a lot of fun doing the course, and it's especially gratifying to see people come through and say what Shrishti just said, which is that it was the course that really inspired people to jump into this field and do some really great work. So that's always fantastic to hear. Now, having said that, let me briefly touch on three challenges that we at BI.org are interested in. And by the way, on the right-hand side, you'll see a picture of a forthcoming book. It's called The Behaviorally Informed Organizations. And I've co-edited it with one of my former doctoral students, Professor Catherine Young. Kat Sunstein has written a foreword for the book, and it has contributions from many, many, many of our academic and industry partners addressing some of the questions that I raised earlier. But the three challenges that we are really interested in are, one, the notion of sludge, and I've spoken about sludge in several forums. Think about sludge as the evil cousin of nudge. Nudge makes things easy for people, sludge makes things difficult for people. And we're interested in trying to see how we can identify scorecards, how we can think about helping organizations see sludge in their systems, and in fact, make sure that we can clean sludge up on an ongoing basis so that we do not create welfare reduction for our end users. So sludge, a big initiative here. embedding the science in organizations. How do we get organizations to be more scientific? And then the one that I'm going to focus on today, the notion of scaling, horizontal and vertical scaling. What we mean by horizontal scaling is taking an idea, taking a product, taking an intervention, and applying that to other contexts, similar contexts, be they in different geographies, be they in different target segments. And vertical scaling simply means taking a pilot, taking a product, and scaling it more broadly to increase coverage within a country, within a segment. And so we're going to talk a little bit about both. And when I go back to the claim that I was going to make, that context is everything, I'm going to make that claim at several levels. I'm going to make the claim that when you read an academic paper, for example, you need to think about the context in which that particular paper was done, the context in which that particular study was conducted, before blindly applying it to your own situation. When you look at a successful intervention or a successful product that was that's been in the news, that you've read about, that has clearly worked somewhere else or at a different point in time, you need to think carefully about the context at that point in time versus the context that you are in now, before you decide to simply transplant that idea into your present context. And so context is complicated, context is multifaceted, context can make or break the success of interventions, of products, and of ideas that we come up with. So that's the general gist of what I'm going to talk about over the next little bit. So let me start off with the notion of translation and scaling. There's a lot of recent work in this area by John List at the University of Chicago and several of his colleagues. I've written a bit with my colleague Tanjim Hussain. And the central idea behind, or the key finding behind the scaling research, is the notion of a voltage drop. So by the way, I'm an engineer by training, and so you'll probably see some of my engineering bias show up here. But a voltage drop is the simple idea that you can take a intervention that has done phenomenally well in a randomized controlled trial or in a lab trial, and then when you take it to the field, it just doesn't work as effectively. The effect sizes are small, it's not powerful. And there's a number of reasons for why that happens. The field is different. The field is what we call heterogeneous. There are different kinds of people. In a trial, we normally do our research in the context of a homogeneous group of people. But in the field, you have different kinds. There's different contexts. And so what works in one context, like I say, may not actually work in a different context. There is also another thing to be aware of, and the idea of publication bias simply suggests that when we read published research, when we read stuff that shows up in our journal, that the underlying principle is that journals tend to publish things that show stronger effects to begin with. Right? And so Stefano Della Vigna and Liz Linos have a fantastic new paper where they look at interventions that were done by a few public policy units across the world, compared the ones that were published in journals versus the ones that were not published in journals. And essentially they find a fairly significant difference in effect size. The stuff that gets published is the stuff where effects are strong. The stuff that doesn't get published is the stuff where effects are weak. And at some level, you would say, well, this is very intuitive. This, as a journal editor, you obviously want to showcase the results that are strong, the results that have shown to have a significant effect. But as a reader, it creates a heuristic-driven bias. It makes you believe that a lot of the research in behavioral science actually results in significant effects. And Prakash, I mean, I heard you ask questions to various panelists earlier today and yesterday about behavioral science being a magic wand. It's often not a magic wand. But we do have this illusion of behavioral science being a magic wand because we only read about the successes and we do not read about the failures. And so that's something important to keep in mind. And in the book that I just mentioned, Catherine and I talk a lot about the whole notion of when we do our research, populations are not representative, the context is not representative, and we often make a case for why there is a fairly serious misunderstanding of what evidence means in the behavioral sciences versus the physical sciences. So these are all points that I'm going to get to in just a minute, but I'm going to go back in history a little bit, and I'm going to go back to the late 1800s. William James, great American philosopher and psychologist, wrote a couple of very influential volumes, uncreatively called The Principles of Psychology. And he made a number of different points in there, but here's the one that stands out for us, which is the idea that behavior is a function of the relationship between an organism, in this case, a human being, and the environment. And William James was simply saying that you cannot study behavior independent of the context, independent of what he called the environment. And in fact, what he called the environment was essentially what we refer to as the context. And so William James, being a philosopher, was fairly dramatic when he wrote about how organisms interact with the environment. He kind of likened human behavior to the act of taking a walk through a forest. And William James would say things like, sometimes the forest presents obstacles, fences, and sometimes there are gates. Sometimes there's a clearing in the pathway. And if you really think about it, the notion of nudge and sludge can actually take roots in some of what William James spoke about. A nudge makes things easy. And so if you see a clearing in a pathway, which essentially leads people to use that path, the easy path, then that's like a nudge. And if in fact there's an obstacle, that's a bit like a sludge. And so I'd say the foundations of a lot of what we talk about today in the notion of choice architecture were actually in the writings of William James back in the late 1800s. A little bit after that, in the early 1900s, Egon Brunswick, who's a Hungarian psychologist who actually doesn't get cited or studied as much as I think he should be, wrote about a lot of things, but one of his key contributions to the field of psychology was the notion of representativeness in experimentation. And he made the point that oftentimes our experiments do not represent the real world. And so let me give you a super quick example, right? So let's imagine you're in marketing, you're trying to understand how much people are willing to pay for a price, or how much they're liking for different kind of products is. And so those of you in marketing are familiar with conjoint analysis type of tasks. So let's imagine you have two quality levels and two pricing levels. And so as an experimental designer, we are taught to make sure that the two variables in our experiments are independent of each other. And so we do a 2x2 design. We'd say, let's look at a high quality, high price product. Let's look at a low quality, low price product. But in the interest of a fully cross design, we also look at a low quality, high price product and a high quality, low price product, because that makes our design complete. Now, Brunswick would say, in the real world, you don't see those two types of products as much. You don't see high quality, low price products or low quality, high price products. And so whatever results you get in the experiment should only be interpreted in the context of the experiment. And that's representativeness 101. Or the opposite corollary to Brunswick's point was that we should experiment with conditions, with the state of the world that actually mirrors the real world. And so if in the real world we find two attributes are correlated with each other, then they should be correlated with each other in the experiment, right? And there's a lot of other things that Brunswick wrote about that we can now interpret as critiques of the way we do experiments, the kinds of questions we ask people. For example, we now know that a lot of the effects that Kahneman and Tversky originally demonstrated, and several others have demonstrated through the famous heuristics and biases programs, might weaken depending on how we ask questions. So one important quote unquote bias in the behavioral science is overconfidence. And we can actually show that overconfidence decreases if you ask people easy questions versus hard questions. We only see overconfidence in certain domains, but we do not see it in all domains. Or the way in which the questions are constructed, right? So we know people struggle with trying to understand probabilities, and we show heuristics and biases when people use probabilities. But if you ask them questions in terms of frequency, then in fact, those effects weaken. Likewise, we know people struggle with the concept of a duration. And so when you ask people questions about hyperbolic discounting today versus 20 days from now or 21 days from now, they struggle with those questions. But when you give them a specific future date, 3 weeks from today on a Friday like today, then they're not as bad at answering those questions. And then finally, obviously, the notion of the population. We want to make sure that our representative population answers our experiments, because otherwise we cannot generalize. And so that's really where we have struggled as a field. And of course, the famous weird abbreviation captures the fact that a lot of the psychology that we sample from as behavioral scientists, that we use to design interventions, is based on a very small geography and a very small subset of the population. And that's something that really needs to be changed. So that was Brunswick. And from Brunswick, I'm going to go on to Richard Taylor. And of course, Richard, we know for many, many things. But one of the things that I'm going to focus on is his most recent book, Misbehaving, and the idea of a SIF. What is a SIF? It is a seemingly or supposedly irrelevant factor. Right. And Richard, of course, argues that there are a lot of things in the context that can change the way people make choices. So the physical features of a context matter, whether you make the decision in a store versus outside the store, whether you make it in a physical store versus a digital store. The surface features of the task matter. How the information is presented to you matter. The time matters. And the time matters not only in the sense of how much time you have to make the decision, but the time of the day matters. The day of the week matters. The season matters. Other things you're doing matter. Whether there are other people around you matters. Everything matters, right? And again, the big takeaway from the fact that SIFs are so important is that we need to be cautious about interpreting the results of other people's experiments, of other people's successes, of other people's products, because your SIFs are probably going to be different from their SIFs. So all of this put together to say, context is everything. All right. And so let me give you the punchline. So if I had like a 5-minute talk today, this is what I would have said. I would have said, well, look, we know it is becoming generally popular to help consumers make better decisions through these large scale behavioral interventions, call them nudges, call them choice architecture interventions. A lot of these interventions are based on convergent published research. And when I say convergent, it means there's a lot of research, not just the one paper, not just the 2 papers, but multiple papers that seem to say the same thing, that seem to point in the same direction. Those pieces of evidence could come from the lab, they could come from small scale trials. Do these interventions always work? I think the answer, as you might have expected, is no, they don't always work. And they don't always work because of 3 things that we need to watch out for. The first thing is context dependence, the notion of a SIF, the notion that our representativeness might not have been maintained in the study as compared to the context that we have at hand. So simple design features of the scaled up interventions could cause secondary effects that completely flip the results. There might be a SIF in your environment that might not just weaken the result, but actually perhaps completely change it. We also see a temptation on the part of many practitioners to throw in as many different interventions into a new product or a new nudge, right? So I've been in meetings where we will review the evidence. We'll say, oh, here's a study that showed that A can cause a particular behavior change. And here's a separate study that shows that B can cause the same behavior change. And a third one that shows that C can cause the same behavior change. And so oftentimes it's tempting to say, well, if all of them can cause that behavior change, why don't we do all of them simultaneously? Let's just put everything into the kitchen sink. Let's see what happens. And sometimes that doesn't work. It doesn't work because these interventions can interact with each other. They can do so in complex patterns and unpredictable ways. And this could be a problem. And then finally, the notion of heterogeneity. Heterogeneity simply means different people react differently to interventions, right? And so if people are different from each other, and I don't just mean across geographies, across cultures. I mean, culture is a big, broad construct, but even within a culture, within a geography, within a city, you could find differences in how people react to interventions. And if we could somehow develop a good science of how to understand those differences, could we potentially customize and scale interventions? In fact, the paper that Tanjam and I recently wrote is called Successfully Scaled Interventions Need Not Be Homogeneous. When we think about scaling, we often say, well, let's look at this idea and let's roll it out to the entire population. And the point we are making is that that may not be a prescription for success, that perhaps if we can understand how different subgroups react to different forms of intervention, then we can somehow customize. Okay, so that's the punchline. Let me spend a minute again on context dependence, because that's really the theme of what I want to drill home today. Keep in mind that the nature of evidence in behavioral science is very different than the nature of evidence in physics. And let me tell you what I mean by that in just a minute. So in the behavioral sciences, we make a case for what we call in situ evidence. What is in situ? Evidence collected in the context in which you want to do your final intervention. So this could be obviously the same culture, the same circumstance, the same media choice, and so on and so forth, the same way in which messages are delivered. Because as we said earlier, SIFs are always different as a function of context. And so you want to make sure that you test with the same SIFs as much as you can, as you will encounter when you roll out the entire product. The other challenge we often see in the world of the practitioner is a solution-mindedness. Practitioners want solutions and they want them quickly. Academia works on slow cycles. So those of you who follow cricket, academia is a lot like a test match. We take our 5 days, we enjoy our cup of teas, we take our breaks, we pace ourselves. Practitioners are a lot like T20 cricket. We want to get it done. By the end of 3 hours, I want a result. And then I'm off to the next game. And solution-mindedness creates a pressure to pick solutions simply. To pick solutions quickly, right? And that results in an over-reliance on frameworks like EAST. So some of you are familiar with the Behavioral Insights team. Make things easy, make things accessible, make things simple, make things timely. There are a lot of these frameworks floating around. And so I wrote an article a couple of years back called The Elegant Simplicity and Potential Pitfalls of simple framework. And the pitfall in my mind is when we rely on a framework, we are relying on somebody else's generalized success stories. But again, we ignore the fact that those other people might have had a different SIF, might have worked in a different context, right? But all of these things create a preference for what I call an off-the-shelf solution. And I'm probably going to be unkind in my next illustration, but that illustration talks a little bit about how we as applied behavioral scientists have gone about choosing how to design interventions, right? And a lot of what happens is I think represented on that first row of this illustration, right? Like you go into a nudge store and then you kind of look around and you say, well, I've got the social proof and Christina has published a lot in that, and let me go look at her papers. And then there's loss aversion and Richard and Kahneman have published a lot there, changing defaults and so on and so forth. You just kind of pick one, right? And you pick one and you try it on, and of course it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit very well, right? Because again, different SIF. The alternate approach is going to a tailor, coming up with a bespoke solution. You measure, you try, you measure, you adapt, right? The Behavioral Insights team actually has a fantastic paper called Test, Learn, Adapt, TLA, right? But one of the things that they don't explicitly emphasize in the paper is that testing must happen in the context in which you are doing the actual intervention, right? Again, I'm going to say this like a few hundred times today. SIFs are different. Okay, so we want to test in the context in which we're going to intervene and in which we're going to actually create a solution. Now, this is very different from the way we think about evidence in, let's say, physics or engineering, right? And the reason for that is the SIFs in physics are not that many. So there's not a whole lot of context effects that determine, for example, gravity. or the speed of light. Okay, the speed of light is the speed of light. It doesn't matter it's in the morning or the evening. It doesn't matter who's shining the light. It doesn't matter who's seeing the light. There are not too many sifts, right? And it's the same for chemistry, to a lesser extent, biology, and so on and so forth. So in a lot of the physical sciences, our context brackets are very wide. We do not have as many sifts that drive our outcome. And so it's perfectly okay for us to read the literature, to do a meta-analysis of what's been published, and simply use those interventions, right? That's very different in the behavioral sciences. And unless we understand that, we will continue to behave as if we are simply going to the nut store and picking up interventions that have worked for other people because we are going to ignore SIF. So let me quickly share with you 3 examples. I'm going to take a few minutes doing this, and then I will shut up and open up for questions and comments and discussion. The 3 examples that I'm going to share with you, one is from South Korea, intervention introduced by the South Korean government to curb credit card overspending. The other 2 examples are going to come from Mexico, and this is work that we at Bear did with our partners Ideas 42, based out of New York, and CONSAR and a couple of their allied funds. CONSAR is the pension authority in Mexico, where we tried to make Mexican pension statements more engaging, more salient, more vivid to try and motivate voluntary contributions. And we also used a text messaging intervention as an implementation prompt for voluntary pension contribution. So very quickly, a couple of minutes on each story, and then we will move on. So story number 1 on credit cards. Right now, we know from behavioral sciences, by work done by a lot of people, that credit cards facilitate spending by reducing the so-called pain of payment. So those of you who were in BE 101X, you've seen some of this stuff. The idea that it's easy to tap a card, you don't experience a pain of parting with your money, but also that paying with credit or paying through electronic means reduces your memory for past expenses. Therefore, you overestimate your available funds, and you make a mistake to the systematic side, which is that you believe always that you have more funds than you have. And so a lot of that research has also shown that if you remind people about how much they have spent in the past, it actually weakens the effect, that people now become a bit more calibrated. And that's classic. That's the idea that, we've got and we've got an effect. We understand why it happens. It's because of a weaker memory trace. We correct for that weakened memory trace, and the effect goes away. Now, we know this thing. We know that this intervention works. We've done it in a lab. We've done it in a small randomized trial. We've done it in quasi-experiments. And so, somebody could read all those papers and basically decide that, look, if as a nation we decide to send reminders to people about how much they have spent, maybe overall spending should go down. Right? And so that was one of the lines of thinking when South Korea introduced this policy. There were several other issues. They were worried about fraud. And let's not get into all of the implementation details. But the bottom line was, once a text alert system was set in place, and this is now a text alert system that's common in many countries. You see it in India, you see it in Canada. But once that was set in place, the government expected spending to go down. The authorities expected spending to go down, but it didn't, right? And not only did it not go down, but there was actually a backfiring effect. And in fact, what ended up happening was that for a significant number of people, about 88%, people actually ended up spending more and not less. Okay, so not only did it not work, it backfired. But again, heterogeneity. For 12%, it worked. Okay, who were these 12%? These were the heavy spenders. For them, it went down. For the light spenders, giving people reminders, reminding them about how much they had spent, actually made the problem worse, right? And ex post, we can explain this. So in our research, we were able to explain why it happened. And it happened because people developed some sort of a digital dependency. There was a difference between the way we had done our experiments in reminding people versus what was happening in the intervention, right? In our experiments, the reminders went through the same channel, the same platform where people were making decisions to purchase, right? So, for example, when you tapped your credit card, it would first show you how much your cumulative spending was, and then it would ask you to confirm that you wanted to make the purchase. But that wasn't the case in the intervention, where the reminder ended up in your mobile phone. And people was like, would say things like, "Oh, if I ever need a record of my expenses, it's in my phone." Right? So they had this digital dependency kind of thing going on. And if only the authorities had done a trial, an in situ trial, before rolling this out nationwide, I suspect they would not have been in the situation where the entire thing backfired spectacularly. And so here it wasn't about the culture per se. It wasn't about culture, right? It wasn't about geography. It was a difference in the original experiment, in the original trial, in the way in which feedback was given in the original set of experiments versus the way they rolled out now. So important detail in the context had a massive role. Okay, Mexico. Without getting into details of Mexico and the pension system, we were trying to get people in Mexico to increase their contributions to their pension funds. And it turns out the voluntary contribution levels are pretty low to begin with. There were not too many people that were contributing voluntarily to the pension system. And here's the way the pension system works. Citizens choose a retirement company, then they make a mandatory contribution, 6.5%. Government believes that you should be saving or contributing an additional 5 to 6% to have a comfortable retirement, right? So that's the story. Everybody in Mexico gets a quarterly statement encouraging you, among other things, to make voluntary contributions. And the statement was rather dull. So the one on the left-hand side here was the way the statement used to look. People didn't really, based on what we could tell, read the statement carefully. It was, as you can see, in two colors, roughly black and white and gray. Nothing more than that. And other than the red, which said important, there was not a whole lot of excitement in that statement. And so one of the things we did was we did an exercise where we said, let's make the statement more engaging. Let's make it informative. Let's give it color. Let's give people the motivation to want to contribute more. And so we introduced a few features. So there was a thermometer here, which essentially showed people how well they were doing. In this case, orange meant not as well as you should be doing, and so that hopefully increased the motivation. We did a few other things. We had interventions where we looked at loss aversion. So, for example, this one, what would you lose if you didn't make voluntary contributions? What would you gain if you made a voluntary contribution? So, again, taking stuff that's worked in the literature that we know has worked in the literature. We tried implementation prompts. So we introduced a wallet cutout so that people can carry that with them and make contributions. And so, the standard toolkit, if you will, in this case, focusing on on a future where you have lots of bills versus focusing on a future where you're enjoying the beach with your family. And a couple of things happen. So for about half the population, this intervention worked. It worked in that we had evidence to suggest, and this was done in the context of a large field trial. So let's focus for a minute on the left-hand side of this picture, right? The high-ranked firm, right? These were people for whom their fund was amongst the higher-ranked funds in terms of performance, right? So imagine the following story. You get your quarterly statement. In the past, you didn't even look at it. Now it looks nice and colorful. It's engaging. You start reading it. You read the information about the performance of your fund. Your fund is doing well. You say, well, I need to save more for retirement. And so a lot of the interventions, the gain frame, the loss frame, the family appeal, the wallet cut, all of these things worked compared to the old statement, right? So you see the pink bars are all taller than the blue bars, right? So simple idea. You make information simpler, you make it more engaging, people read it, they're motivated, they contribute more, right? But see what happened on the right hand side. This is what happens when your fund isn't a high performing fund. Okay, so and as you can imagine, like in any given period, you will have some high performing and some low performing funds. It's the ranking that matters. It's not the absolute level ranking, right? So this is a low ranked firm. Okay, and here's the story that I think is going on here is now you made the information simple. Now you made it engaging. People looked at the performance and they said something like, "Oh my God, my fund isn't doing well. I need to save more. Maybe I'll just invest somewhere else." And so we found people took money out. Well, maybe they didn't take money out, but they reduced voluntary contributions compared to the control. And that's a classic example of a backfiring effect because two things were going on in the old world. Information about the fund and the performance wasn't easily visible. But when we made it visible, we made it easy to see, now it backfired. And so again, a different form of heterogeneity, but something that we needed to have thought about. And so now, obviously, as we are designing further interventions, we'll keep in mind that you also highlight negative information through making information simple. And so just simplifying information doesn't always end up in the desired outcome because now you throw the spotlight on negative information and that has a perverse effect. Okay? Last example, and then I'll start winding up. So we also sent in Mexico text reminders to people. And again, in designing these text reminders, we did the usual stuff. We looked at, it's just a simple reminder. So the basic alert was, it's the end of the month. Maybe you should consider making a voluntary contribution. Or the fresh start effect, right? And in particular, we do it at the beginning of the month. So it's a new month, time to start thinking about the future. A small amount intervention. John Gorville has written about pennies a day. And so we used an idea like that. For only a few pesos a day, you can actually ensure your successful retirement. Individual security, think about yourself in the future. Lots of these kinds of interventions have been shown to be successful in the United States and the UK. And then the family security. And this was interesting because we've been talking a lot about culture and what messages work where. Individual security, building empathy with your future self has been shown to be a really powerful motivator in like I said, the US, in the UK, in many weird countries, if you will. It doesn't work as well in Mexico. It's a very family-driven society. And so a lot of people interpreted thinking about your own future and contributing towards your own future as taking away from my family's present, right? And so the messaging had to change. The messaging had to become your family's future. And so long story short, we did a test with all of these different kinds of interventions. The chart here shows you the results. And I'm going to just, for a moment, look at the two conditions: control, which is no messaging, versus the family security message. And so you can see the difference in the bars. And so clearly it worked, right? Now, as I reflect back on how we as social scientists do our research, or how we as practitioners report the results of our research, this is what we do. We look at a control condition, we look at a treatment condition, and we show two bars, and we say, well, as long as the treatment bar, as long as the intervention does better than the control, we are happy. We deem the intervention a success, right? Now, that's great, but there's much more we can do, right? So, for example, this family security bar obviously might not work for people that don't have a family. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure it out. But the rocket science is in figuring out who doesn't have a family, right? Because as you are scaling, you're not doing this on a one-by-one basis. You're broadly sending out text messages, right? And so in our research, we essentially used a simple machine learning technique. And I'm not going to get into details, but it's a clustering algorithm, right? So we can actually send out these different interventions and we can generate clusters based on age and gender and whether there were previous contributors or not. These were the only three demographics that we knew about all the people receiving the messages. And we can now start plotting which is the cluster to which the family security works the best, and we can now start seeing heterogeneity, right? So again, this is heterogeneity within Mexico, within a certain fund, and here's what we found, for example, right? So just comparing the control versus the family security bar, for age less than 27, uh, the family security message backfires, right? So on an average, these are people that don't have a family, right? It's really strong in the middle age group, as you see here, the 28 to 42. The intervention works really well. Greater than 43, it doesn't really work significantly, right? And now we can start getting pictures like this as a function of age, as a function of gender, as a function of the interaction between age and gender. So, for example, for women, the cutoff is more like 25 years of age. For men, it's more like 29. And ex post, after we've done the analysis, we can explain all of that, right? But the trick is in making the prediction. Okay, and what we've learned is if we apply these kind of clustering algorithms to digitally delivered or electronically delivered data, we can, as a habit, start understanding heterogeneity, start understanding these different clusters, even within a context, even within a culture, right? Even within a geography. And so context within is equally important than culture. I love studying culture. I think it's a great thing to think about. But oftentimes it's not just culture. It's even more heterogeneous than that. And context, like I say, takes the form of sifts that are very difficult to see, but we can infer what those sifts are for different people. So let me start wrapping up. Is the field weird? Yeah, it is weird. It is weird. It is definitely weird. And it is particularly weird if you treat published research as representative and true. And by that, I don't mean that the research is wrong, but it's only true in the presence of certain sifts. And I think we must try and make it a habit to ask ourselves every time we read published work, every time we read somebody's fantastic bestseller book, every time we read about successful interventions and products, what were their sifts? What was the context, right? And do I expect that same context to hold in my case? But it doesn't matter if you're working on your applied research using a custom tailored approach, right? So avoid the temptation to go to the nudge store and simply pick an off-the-shelf solution, because that's going to land you in trouble. So let me quickly wrap up. The first important point that I do want to make is the nature of evidence in behavioral science is very, very different. We must have in situ testing. And if you don't do in situ testing, you're essentially ignoring the sifts at your own peril. One. Two, we need to embrace heterogeneity. We need to account for heterogeneity. We need to account for differences in mindset, in context, and sifts. So successfully scaled interventions need not be homogeneous. In fact, the best ones are actually not homogeneous. And then finally, avoid over-reliance on frameworks like East and Simpler. I mean, they're great. They're a good starting point. They have a role to play. They help us think about the basic principles. But I think, our research, our intervention design, our product design needs to be grounded in simple first principles. And if it is not grounded, then we are essentially ignoring the fact that context is everything, and that may not be a good idea. So let me just quickly end up by thanking a lot of people who have contributed to this work. I'm not going to name all of them, but in particular, I want to thank a few agencies at the bottom of this slide: CONSAR in Mexico, the Canada Research Share Program in Canada, IDS 42, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and of course, funding from BEAR for a lot of this work. So I will shut up and turn it back to you for questions and comments and suggestions.
Thank you so much, Professor Dilip. That was power-packed. We actually had a lot of questions, but then we realized you have already covered.
You've literally covered it all.
We did have a lot of questions around culture, what we typically call the Eastern way of looking at problems or the nature of reality or the universe, as opposed to the Western way. And we were wondering, what would your point of view be on it as someone who has straddled across both the cultures?
Yeah.
A good amount of it you've already touched, but if you want to say something more, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that you bring up the notion of culture as an explanation for differences in behavior, right? And I think that's true to some extent, right? The way we are trained to think, the way we are trained to generate responses, the way we're even trained to attribute success and failure to ourselves versus the context, more broadly speaking, does determine the way in which we react to situations, right? And so, having lived in the United States and to a lesser extent in Canada, you see this whole notion of individual having mastery over their environment. But as someone born in India, for example, I mean, there's no mastery, and so I end up sort of somewhere in the middle of the two. Is learning to recognize where you have the mastery and where you don't. All right, and I think that's an important skill. Is oftentimes people either swing to one worldview or the other worldview, but it's really recognizing what are things you can control and what are the things that you can minimize in terms of what you can do, and then working according to that. So the COVID pandemic, for example, has given us a classic way of thinking about this. The COVID-19 has changed the world in that we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. All right, and when predictions about tomorrow become harder to make, then we need to change the way we think about using information to make decisions. Okay? In the past, experience mattered. Right? It mattered because yesterday was the same as day before yesterday and the same as the day before that. And so we've learned during those 3 or 4 days, the world is going to look a lot like that tomorrow. And so we can apply that learning to the future. But now that may not be the case. If tomorrow is going to look very different, then yesterday's experience might not help me, right? And so, I've already exposed my nerdiness in terms of engineering and cricket, but so here's a third one, which is Star Trek or Star Wars, right? So Star Wars, right? Return of the Empire. Remember the scene where Han Solo is navigating the Falcon through the asteroid belt? And at the beginning, I think C-3PO says, the odds are 1 in 2.8 million, whatever it was, right? And he basically says, forget it, like odds are irrelevant, right? And so what you need is a ship which is maneuverable. You need the ability to immediately see what's happening in front of you. And you need to know how things are going to change. So it's not like knowing the model, it's knowing what the model is, right? And I think that's, in essence, a very different approach to living life. It's navigating life rather than managing life. And these might sound like a semantic difference, but to the extent that the world is unpredictable, we need better navigation skills. To the extent that the world is predictable, then management is fine, right? I mean, to me, management is like driving with your rear view mirror. Navigation is making sure you have a good widescreen. So I don't know if that answers your question or probably makes it even more complex to understand.
And thank you for bringing up Star Wars and Star Trek. In fact, Reshma keeps on bringing up Star Trek world when we, get into our own work around culture and consumer. And it's always lovely to bring about the stories of the Romulans and the Vulcans and the Klingons, and the Ferengi on the Star Trek side, and explain how, the Federation of Planets is planning to go with a non-judgmental approach. Yeah. Number one, with the Prime Directive, and then figure out solutions all the way to interact with them, given their cultural codes. We find it easy to use that. We also noticed sometime back, you said, there's an over-reliance on framework, and there are two things essentially, I think, which we, when I say we, I mean a lot of practitioners face. Number one is this whole question of framework, over-reliance, where it almost looks like knowing the name of a framework or two nudges makes you a behavioral science superstar now. Unlike the other sciences, the entry to bar is quite low. I keep on saying you can't quote the first law of physics of inertia and say, I know physics now. But it's very easy to say, I know, the laws of motion. And now you know something about behavioral science. So,
but Prakash, one other quick thing, I'm just going to jump in there, right? There is another difference, which is the first law of physics is often a lot more universally applicable than, for example, loss aversion, right? And I think that's the point that people miss.
Yes.
So anyway, I'll let you continue. Sorry.
Okay. So, it is easy for us, or many of us, to deal with the whole over-reliance on frameworks. In fact, there was an incident where we, just created a new framework for someone it was last name was called, and we said, you know what, you need framework. Here is one for you. I'll make one for you using your surname. And we turn call into like knowledge isn't enough. People need context. Adoption is all about behavior. U was understanding takes time. People may use shortcuts or biases. And L was let fish eat worms. Meet people where they are. Don't give them strawberries if they want worms, right? So it was a way of explaining that. The other challenge, though, is this whole question of, and you mentioned saying people think it's a magic wand, 100% guaranteed solution. But on the other hand, there are people who are skeptics. We had a panel yesterday from Latin America, and Mayra Alejandra was there, Carlos Cartagini was there from IADV, and they say there's almost at times a reluctance to take in an advice when you present it as a behavioral solution. So there is this spectrum on where people...
It's something that we've seen ourselves also in possibly around 16 or 2015 or 16. When you went around with an intervention, you had an idea that dealt with behavior. It was immediately that, no, that's not what we're looking for. We are looking for, there is an over-reliance on communication. And the idea that if you tell people what to do, they'll just do it. Or you point them in that direction. And
there is. So I have a couple of quick comments on that. So one is, I think that there is that issue of people having a mental model of what a behavioral solution is, right? But I do think that we as applied behavioral scientists are a bit to blame for it. And we're a bit to blame because I actually think it's really hard to articulate a problem as purely behavioral versus not. Right. I mean, at some level, every problem is behavioral. No problem is behavioral. Right. Like I said, I'm an engineer, so I kind of see everything as process. OK, so and maybe I shouldn't, but maybe it's an aspect of the process that causes a behavioral problem. Maybe it's an aspect of the communication that causes a behavioral problem. Right. And so maybe, maybe there's a different story to be told about what our contribution is. It's not about changing behavior per se, but changing something else to change behavior. Because I think organizations also, and I think that's one of the points we make in our book too, is organizations exist in silos. We know that, right? I mean, it's all very fine to say, I wish there were no silos, but they're not going away any soon. So we've got to work with the silos. So I think that's one, right? I think the other thing that we need to think a little bit about is where our contribution is. And I think our contribution is really in helping people collect the evidence. Right. And so there's this whole notion of test, learn, adapt. Right. To me, ideas are cheap. Right. Anyone can come up with an idea. Making it work is the challenge. And I think to the extent that we can help organizations reduce the cost of experimentation, to me, that's success. All right. And so, oftentimes I sit in these, and I'm sure the two of you have done the same in like these marketing quote unquote strategy sessions where we spend like 4 hours trying to figure out whether we should offer like a discount or, add a new product, like a new ad or something, right? And I often feel like saying, why don't we just like test it out? Like, let's do a trial, right? Because the answer to that question depends on SIFs, okay? And oftentimes as a consultant, I'll be brought in and I'll say, okay, I don't know the answer to that question, but I can tell you how to find out. That's where I can contribute, right? And of course, there's a healthy mix of skepticism, which is like, we're paying you all this money and all you're going to come in and tell us is like collect data. But I think that truly is where we can make a difference, is to help organizations understand that the test, learn, adapt approach, the in situ testing approach is a surefire way. And I mean, Google has learned this, right? Like, there are no strategy sessions at Google. You want a blue background or red? Well, let's figure it out, right? And I think that's the gold standard that we need to move towards. By the way, I didn't want to see. I see Cooley behind you. Well done.
And guide. These were career options in case it doesn't work out.
So I'm not going to ask you what role in Cooley, but let's.
But then the fantastic story about this poster, because you bring it up when you're talking about culture, and you say, "Well done." And we were speaking with someone from Caribbean, Steve Audit, and I think he's going to join us tonight on the design thinking panel. And he noticed that, and he said, you know what, in the Caribbeans, that's an offensive slur to me, the word coolie, right? So culturally, there are, I mean, you've spoken it all.
Look, I mean, there's obviously heterogeneity in language and expression, right? I mean, to me, these are the easy wins in communication, right? But I do think there is something fundamentally similar across people as a species, right? And you're a Star Trek person. You know how different humans are, or humans are, from the Ferengi and so on, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's really the notion of exploiting exploiting is a strong word, but understanding the underlying similarity while respecting the interventions that cause those effects, right? So my sense is, in general, all of us are loss averse. I mean, maybe to different extents, right? But the way you would express your loss aversion, or what you would consider a loss, might be different in India versus Canada versus the Caribbean. And I think we need to think about all of our basic psychological variables along those two dimensions. We often tend to confuse how we trigger loss aversion, for example, or mental accounting or whatever else, with the act of mental accounting itself, right? It's categorization, right? All of us categorize things. I mean, it's a no-brainer, like, human beings, that's what we do. But that's the root of good stuff, which is it makes it easier for us to process information. Bad stuff, stereotypes. All right. So I think it's really the how that we as behavioral scientists can focus on. But the what, I think, is like, a lot of people talk about cultural differences, but I mean, I think we should respect the similarities. I think the species has adapted from the same basic principles, and I think there's a lot of similarity. But to your point, I think at the surface, obviously, lots of differences.
There's actually related to what you were talking about. Sirjan Kaur asks, are there any universals that override context? And
so no, is the short answer, right? And again, like, as a scientist, I would never say for sure, but no. So for example, let's pick loss aversion, right? I mean, that's one of the most replicable findings in our field, right? People have tried to replicate, and worst case, we don't get a strong effect, but loss aversion generally works, right? Now you can actually think about framing effects like loss aversion in a marketplace context, right? So for example, framing something as a gain versus loss, okay? We know that losses loom larger than gains, and so if there's a price differential, frame it as a potential loss versus a gain. If everybody else in the market is doing it, and now your decision is, should I frame it as a gain versus loss, right? It turns out framing as a loss might not work well for you in a competitive setting, okay? But that's not because loss aversion is different. It's because a new attribute, in this case novelty, becomes salient, right? And so often it's hard to people will do this and say, well, loss aversion didn't work, right? It's not clear to me loss aversion didn't work. What's probably happening is something else is overriding it, right? And so that's what makes this field interesting. We really need to understand whether it's the underlying effect that's stronger or weaker, or is there something else that's dampening the effect of that?
Well, I can see I've been searching, and there are a lot of questions, and we have about 3 minutes time. I'm at a loss which one to pick up.
Randomly.
Random, right? All right. Okay, fine. Here is this question from Pedro Alcarpillo from Heuristica, Peru, Lima. How can we know if the result of a research has external validity?
It's really the notion of matching context again, right? So in the book, for example, in the last chapter, Catherine writes a nice sort of checklist where it's a series of a few questions where you can go in and see, context is a function of physical environment, context is a function of how information is delivered, and so on and so forth. So it's just a checklist, right? And you go through the checklist and see, well, look, here's my context, here's theirs. It's same on every dimension. I think you're then reasonably confident that the effect should replicate, right? But any of those things don't have check marks, then our prescription is to test on that dimension at the very least, right? So does delivering the same message through a text message versus an app, does it have the same effect? And it's a simple test to do. And then there is one, I think we'll take up the last question is from Jayati Jayatigar. And the question is there something about collectivistic cultures and individualistic cultures which has prominently popped out in the research done so far? Gosh, I mean, a lot has popped out. I'm not even going to go into what I know about that research. I will say that I'm like, and you probably know this based on the last 58 minutes, I'm not convinced that collectivism versus individualism actually explains anything. Right? It does, it's a good top level view, and it's again in the spirit of categorization, right? Like there's like a million different sifts, a million different things, and we can say, well, let's categorize them into two kinds, collectivist and individual, right? But I'm not convinced that those explain stuff. It's a good story to tell. And I don't mean anything negative about the research, right? But yeah, I mean, we know that collectivists behave in a certain way. We know that, for example, attention to what the world thinks about me, playing a role in decision making is different for collectivists versus. I mean, we know all of that stuff, right? Mastery over the environment, but to me, I think I'm much more of a bottom up researcher, right? Like let's not divide the world into two camps and look for differences. Let's try and understand each of the sifts. Let's try and understand what role does language play or whatever else, right? So that's a complicated answer to a simple question.
I really wish we had more time, because it seems like we could just keep having this conversation.
We could. It's a bit of a somber day. One of my childhood, heroes as a musician passed away earlier today, SP Balasubramaniam.
Yes.
So I'll just end up with a note saying that we should, we should always be aware of what's happening in the world around us. We respect all kinds of art, culture, all of that stuff, and be as inclusive as we can. But SPB was special. He was a great singer, inspiration for a lot of people in my generation. May he rest in peace.
Thank you so much, Dilip. You spoke at wonderful things. You talked about engineering. You talked about Star Wars, behavior. You talked about culture. It's a beautiful tribute to SPB. We are not. No one is happy about this has happened, and it's always troubling to know something that has happened, especially if it's a childhood hero. Thank you so much for spending this fantastic hour with us. And on behalf of all the people who have logged in from different corners of the world, we thank you again.
My pleasure. Thank you for organizing this.
Have a good day.
Take care.